Alright, got a very interesting critical thought today. We're going to be discussing about serious topics when it comes to video games, and can they be given the proper dedication and care that they deserve. And this comes from my recent play of Celeste, a 2D indie platformer that also deals with the topic of depression. And I don't think it really worked when it came to depicting it or giving it a interesting treatment. And to discuss why would be way beyond the focus for today's video. But over the last decade, we have seen more pushes for, I guess, creating more serious stories or depicting very unique situations. And for our video today, we're going to define serious as either dealing with a real-life event or tragedy, or discussing a real-life mental or physical disorder. So something that has actually happened or happens to people in our life, and showing that in a video game. And as we've said, there have been many attempts at doing this, especially in the independent space, be it discussing racism, misogyny, misandry, religion, name a major tragedy, and so on. Now, a lot of these games don't exactly make it into the general or consumer markets for obvious reasons, because it's going to be very unlikely that a store like GameStop or Walmart wants to do a video game that covers insert any kind of tragedy here. But whenever we talk about serious topics in video games, there are a lot of fair points about criticizing developers who go this route. And it comes down to a few major topics. The first one is basically the essential element of video games, and that is they are meant to be played. And not only that, but they're also a product. What this means is no matter how you try to frame a serious topic, at the end of the day, this is going to be seen in a title that is meant to be sold to consumers, and it's meant to be interacted. And that's a very major point when it comes to depicting this stuff compared to other industries or other consumer elements such as TV, movie, books, and so on. In those respective industries, the player or the consumer is a passive participant. You're there for the ride. You're not the one who's determining what's going on or causing these events to happen. And again, it creates a very different dynamic compared to the passive experience. And because of that, a lot of people who criticize games for this will usually say that they will either glorify the bad or they'll exploit the good. And we're going to talk about both right now. When we're discussing exploiting the good, we're referring to games that try to play up the emotional angle or the severity or magnificence of the event as simply either gameplay or to try again to get that response out of the player. And again, it is a different experience when you are the passive watcher rather than someone who's experiencing it or interacting with it firsthand. A really good case in point would be the classic movie Saving Private Ryan. Now, one of the most memorable scenes in that movie, and one of the most memorable scenes I think in film, is the depiction of the Normandy invasion. I think it takes about 10 to 15 minutes of the movie at the start, and this is just a brutal display of the savagery of war. People are dying left and right to the point that you can't even really associate a face to a voice because there's just so much carnage going on. And the movie doesn't play any music during the actual fight, and instead just lets the sound effects and the bullets whizzing by be the music for that part. It's done very respectively, and it's basically there not to condemn or condone, but to basically say, this is what happened on the beaches of Normandy. Now, we can contrast that to Call of Duty World War II lately, that turned the beaches of Normandy into a glorified lobby with loot boxes raining from the sky. And this is why a lot of people feel that it's very easy to exploit these elements. You can say that your game is trying to represent people with a specific mental disorder or a physical disorder, but it becomes a different matter when you're trying to integrate that into the video game. A few months ago, we did a live cast talking about adapting video games to other mediums, and the biggest point of contention is that video games once again have to be interacted with, and it doesn't look well when you have something like, okay, gameplay, very serious moment about a real life topic, gameplay. It's seen more or less like you're trying to earn brownie points with that specific group or for people who suffer from it. For instance, with Tomb Raider, and the more I think about the Tomb Raider reboots, the less highly I think of them, but they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. On one hand, they say that Lara Croft is a woman who is traumatized with PTSD from her survival of the island and the death of her father, and then on the other hand, she is leaping off cliffs and stabbing people in the head with her climbing pickaxe of death. And it becomes a very eye-rolling moment when you hear writers of these games talk about how they're trying to convey this serious story and they're trying to elevate the medium, but then you have scenes where people are just running around killing everyone in massive displays of action. The same goes for Uncharted, where it's very hard to take the Uncharted story seriously, where in between these high drama moments of Nathan Drake dealing with his friends and family and trying to make sense of his life, that he's basically killing armies of men. Oh, and he can survive gunshot wounds simply by leaning against whatever object he finds lying around. And this is, of course, where we could easily segue into talking about ludonarrative dissonance, but that's another topic way too big. But it does play a role here, because how do you tell a serious story at the same time having these gameplay mechanics and conventions along for the ride? And for people who are watching this, we are going to ignore visual novel style games that deal with serious topics because there's no gameplay hook, and that's what we want to focus on. Now, another major point again is what happens when you're trying to again score these points with these minority issues or serious disorders. To give you an example, there is a game from the last decade that dealt with a character who was, I think he had that mental or that neurological condition where they don't feel pain. And as someone who deals with chronic pain, I thought that would have been very interesting to see. But what happens is, after about 5 to 10 minutes of play, he gets alien powers and all that gets put aside. The same thing happened with The Surge. The Surge starts out with a very powerful moment of you playing a man who is wheelchair bound. And the game could have done some very interesting things discussing what it means to walk again and getting aided by technology. But once again, 5 minutes in and all that disappears in favor of Dark Souls style combat. And this is why a lot of people are deservedly so criticizing games for trying to tell serious stories where it's just seen more like a checklist or checking things off. And then the other part is how things are represented. And going back to Celeste with their talk about depression, it's very hard to show these real life traumas and disorders and again tie them to gameplay. Again, we're not going to talk about that game in terms of spoilers, but imagine, for instance, if we had a game that wanted to deal with the real life issue of teen suicide. And how it's depicted in this game is every few minutes you are required to do a music rhythm mini game to the musics of Taylor Swift or Katy Perry. It probably wouldn't go so well. But again, the problem is, how do you marry a serious discussion or a serious topic to video games that are meant to entertain and again involve the player interacting? Now, the other part of the equation is what it means to glorify the bad. And this is a very big topic. And it goes back to something I talked about on Game Wisdom a few years ago with regards to taboo topics in the game industry. And one of the big ones is depicting real life events and cultures as negatives, or just showing a violent or horrible act. Now, when it comes to showing real life tragedies and bad people, there is a very fine line between showing them in their true light and trying to get a rise out of the audience and, be able to show. It's kind of like that whole thing we see on YouTube with people showing very exploitive or sensitive stuff to, clickbait and whatnot. But the problem is, again, with video games, when you're dealing with the interaction side of things, it really takes on a whole new level when you're showing or asking the player to participate in a real-life tragedy or real-life event like that. For instance, in Wolfenstein The New Order, there is a very disturbing section that takes place about halfway through the game where BJ is forced to investigate or infiltrate a concentration camp. And in that camp scene, there's a part where, I forget if you're either pushed or you have to go down to hide, but you take a garbage chute down to find all the corpses that the Nazis have killed that are waiting to be burned in the ovens. And again, that is a very disturbing moment, even more encapsulated by the fact that that happened in real life. And you think the game would be able to tie that into a bigger lesson or the severity of that incident. But once again, 2 minutes later, and you're once again killing Nazis and robots with heavy metal music blaring in the background. And again, just showing these actions or these events doesn't magically score you points. And for a lot of people, again, it's viewed as trying to make light or profit off of these emotional and very traumatic situations. And once again, getting back to the whole, Ludo narrative or gamey elements, we can talk about games that try to get an emotional rise out of the player. One of the more infamous scenes from the last few years would have been Call of Duty's Press X to Pay Respect scene, where you press a button and you are trying to give a memorial to fallen soldiers. Or in Shadow of Mordor, where the stealth kill mechanic is briefly replaced by stealth kiss your wife or show affection to your wife. And again, when you tie gameplay to emotion or to tragedy, it can be seen as you trying to exploit it. And again, when we talk about games that are trying to discuss real life tragedies, it's very hard to show that and show the severity of that in real life while still trying to, again, entertain the player. A few years ago, I came with an idea for a game that would take place during the Salem witch trials, and I know there have been developers who have also had ideas similar. And again, it sounds very interesting. But then you remember that this actually happened. People were burned at the stake, or burned at the stakes for it. And then you think, how do you do this without trying to play up the fact that real people were murdered during this time? And again, whenever you try to make a video game built around a tragedy or real life event, it can be seen as exploiting it. So, we're about 13, almost 14 minutes in, and I want to get back to the original question. How is it possible to show a serious topic in a video game without it being seen as exploitive or glorifying? And it's not an easy topic, that's for sure. But we've seen developers try to do this, and I think they've succeeded in some elements. And the games that have done it, I feel, are those that, instead of trying to display the event, it's more about getting the player to think about what it means to participate or witness this firsthand. And I can think of a few examples, and I won't get your thoughts if you can think of other ones as well. But the first one that comes to mind would be something like Papers, Please, where it's about essentially managing a border station during the Cold War in a fictional country. And again, the game doesn't outright say, this is good, this is bad. It basically puts you in a situation and say, what do you think about what's going on? The same goes for This War of Mine, which we really do need to spend more time with at some point in the future. But this is a game that talks about war from the civilian or survivor's point of view. And once again, it doesn't get into high-level philosophy about war's good or war's bad, but simply is meant to give you the idea of what it means to live in a war zone. Now we also have cases of games that try to deal with heavy topics or heavy philosophical topics that, once again, it's not about telling the player what is or what isn't, but lets them try and figure things out on their own. An example of this would be the Swapper, which I'm going to spoil the twist right now for, I think the game's like, what is it, like 6-7 years old at this point. But the Swapper's main mechanic is his device that lets you basically teleport yourself from one spot to another, and then create copies of yourself to perform actions. But we learn near the end of the game that the Swapper isn't a teleportation device. What it is, it clones the person who uses it, and the original copy basically dies. So after that very first use of the Swapper device, you've basically killed yourself. And the game goes into a deep discussion about what it means to be alive. Is a person basically more than the collective sum of their parts? What does it mean to be a living human being? Or what does it mean to have conscious thought? And the same kind of discussion went with the Talos principle that dealt, I think, with transhumanism. No, I'm sorry, not transhumanism, but again, with a discussion of what does it mean to have a soul? And can a machine achieve sentience? And again, those are topics way too big for us to talk about today. But once again, it's about putting the player in front of these situations and basically posing the simple question, what do you think about it? And those more personal stories, I think, do a better job of conveying the seriousness rather than some kind of bombastic tale. Going back to the Saving Private Ryan example from earlier, that could have gone so wrong if it could have been a video game. Imagine playing a game where you're running the same thing on the beach of Normandy, but every time someone dies, you see a score pop up, or an achievement comes up at the end saying, "You've survived Normandy." It would have been looked at as very tasteless indeed. And that's the point. When it comes to talking about these serious topics, you really have to walk a fine line. Again, between trying to show someone or explain to them the severity or the real life consequences, and trying to get a rise out of someone or exploiting it for money. So, what do you think about this topic? And for anyone who has written a game idea or has worked on a game that tried to deal with the severity of a serious topic, let me know some of your thoughts about this and some of the challenges that you ran into as well. And before anyone mentions it, because I didn't bring it up, the white phosphorus scene in Spec Ops: The Line would certainly be an interesting case, again, of trying to depict the seriousness of a real-life application, but in game form. And we could probably spend a few minutes discussing that one. But let's wrap things up here. So, let's once again summarize, when it comes to video games and trying to discuss serious or real-life topics, it's very hard to, again, bring the fact that the player is meant to be entertained and that you are selling a product, and justify that or juxtapose the fact that you are trying to depict a real-life disorder or real-life event in a, trying to think of the term I want to use, I guess in a respectful light. And there is a lot we could go into, and probably more that we haven't even discussed here. But if you can think of other topics relating to this, or topics you'd like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, check back for daily discussions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great night, and hopefully we won't have such a serious topic to discuss. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/gwblazer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.